The issue defining global commerce for years, the imposition of tariffs, which have seen businesses absorb billions and funnel vast sums into the U.S. Treasury, is now facing its most significant legal challenge. This seismic event, encapsulated in the consolidated Supreme Court cases like Learning Resources versus Trump, involves a colossal potential $1.2 trillion trade battle that directly questions the limits of presidential authority. At the core of the conflict is President Trump's unprecedented invocation of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA, to impose duties, a statute traditionally reserved for sanctions against hostile nations and asset freezes, not for broad economic policy or taxation. This case cuts to the heart of the constitutional separation of powers. Can the president levy what are essentially taxes on American imports without explicit authorization from Congress, which the Constitution vests with the power of the purse? The Supreme Court heard oral arguments on November 5, 2025, on an expedited schedule, signaling the gravity of the matter. Initial questioning from justices across the ideological spectrum indicated skepticism toward the government's claim that IEEPA grants such sweeping tariff authority, raising concerns over whether the executive branch is attempting to create a one-way ratchet that permanently usurps legislative power. The ruling, expected possibly before the end of the term, will either dramatically expand presidential trade power or force a massive, instantaneous economic shift, potentially obligating the U.S. government to refund billions of dollars in collected duties to importers. To truly grasp the stakes of this landmark legal challenge, one must examine the specific statutory tool President Trump utilized to implement his sweeping tariffs, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA. Enacted in 1977, IEEPA was originally designed to furnish the president with limited, specific authority to act swiftly during genuine foreign-source national crises, such as freezing the assets of hostile foreign governments or imposing targeted sanctions. However, the current litigation, consolidated under cases like Learning Resources versus Trump, involves the colossal potential $1.2 trillion trade battle. By declaring the massive trade deficit an economic emergency, this application is highly controversial because tariffs function as a tax, ultimately paid by American importers and consumers, and the Constitution in Article 1, Section 8 explicitly grants the power to lay and collect taxes solely to the legislative branch, Congress. The core question before the Supreme Court is therefore one of statutory interpretation and, more importantly, the fundamental separation of powers doctrine. The 9 justices spent nearly 3 hours during oral arguments probing whether Congress, when it wrote IEEPA, intended for a law about sanctions to silently delegate its exclusive, fundamental power to tax and unilaterally reshape national trade policy, a delegation that, if upheld, would dramatically shift the balance of authority toward the executive branch. The 3-hour oral argument before the Supreme Court was highly illuminating, revealing a strong bipartisan skepticism concerning the president's expansive claim of authority under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA. This skepticism transcended the typical ideological divisions, focusing intensely on the structural balance of power in government. Chief Justice John Roberts, a conservative, pointedly challenged the government's counsel, asking why Congress would fail to use the explicit term tariffs in IEEPA if it intended to delegate its fundamental power to tax, noting that tariffs are intrinsically revenue-generating impositions on Americans, which is a core Article 1 power reserved for the legislature. Further magnifying the administration's challenge, Justice Neil Gorsuch invoked the Major Questions Doctrine, which requires Congress to provide a clear, explicit mandate for executive actions that possess vast economic or political significance, such as a multi-trillion-dollar tariff regime. The justices across the board expressed concern over establishing a one-way ratchet, a precedent where the executive branch could perpetually accumulate legislative power via vague statutes, making it nearly impossible for Congress to reclaim its constitutional authority. thus ensuring this case is truly about the structural integrity of the American government and who ultimately controls the nation's purse strings. The financial implications of a Supreme Court decision to strike down the IEEPA-based tariffs would be immediate and profound, affecting potentially over $100 billion in collected duties, which represents the tariff revenue amassed since the policy's imposition. Should the court rule the use of IEEPA unlawful, U.S. Customs and Border Protection would be forced to halt the collection of future duties, and, more critically, the government could face a complex and unprecedented legal obligation to refund billions of dollars to the American businesses that paid those tariffs at the port. This scenario is administratively complex and could trigger disputes between importers and their downstream customers regarding who ultimately receives the repayment, but it promises a significant potential injection of capital back into the economy. Beyond domestic economics, the ruling carries a major trade shock component, as the IEEPA tariffs have functioned as a critical negotiating leverage point, shaping recent global trade discussions and agreements. If the legal bedrock of these tariffs is removed, these carefully constructed diplomatic frameworks could unravel, fostering intense, though likely temporary, international uncertainty. Crucially, the administration has already prepared a Plan B, signaling that a loss would prompt a pivot to other statutory authorities, such as Section 232, National Security, or Section 301, Unfair Trade Practices, to keep tariffs in place. While this shift would require more time and more specific investigations than the broad IEEPA declaration, the underlying trade policy stance of the administration remains firm, ensuring the true casualty of an adverse ruling would be the president's ability to use a sweeping emergency declaration for broad unilateral economic policy. This consolidated Supreme Court case, Learning Resources versus Trump, has instantly become the central battleground for both American trade policy and the constitutional balance of power, its urgency highlighted by the court granting an expedited schedule to hear arguments. Though a decision is not mandated until the end of the term in June 2026, the nature of the economic disruption has raised the possibility of a ruling much sooner, potentially before the new year. The oral arguments provided a strong signal, transcending typical political divides, that the justices believe Congress must provide an explicit, clear mandate for such sweeping authority. The core constitutional tenet at stake is the fundamental principle that the power to tax resides exclusively with the legislative branch, a point the justices pressed repeatedly during the hearing. A ruling against the president would not merely adjust trade policy, it would be a foundational decision that reinforces the separation of powers and forces the White House to pivot to other, more constrained statutory authorities to maintain its tariff structure. Regardless of the outcome, the case has already framed the debate. The executive branch's claim to an expansive, emergency economic power is now subject to direct judicial challenge, and the court must ultimately decide whether it will enforce the constitutional boundary and potentially trigger a massive, though complex, trade policy overhaul. Take a second to like, share, and comment below, and of course, subscribe to join the community.